He stepped over the rope without hesitation, didn't ask, didn't wait, just flashed a badge and name-dropped the vice president. He was one of Kamala Harris's attorneys, and he thought that was enough. But the Royal Guard didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't care who he worked for, just gave one line: "Stationary quarters are not for negotiation." The courtyard went still. Everyone waited for the guard to be overruled. Instead, Kamala Harris stepped forward and said the one thing no one expected. He crossed the line. Let's go back. No shouting, no drama, just quiet discipline and public humility. Now, before we show you what happened when tradition held the line, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Let's get into it. The August heat pressed down on Buckingham Palace like a velvet curtain, thick, weighty, unrelenting. The gold-tipped railings shimmered under the noon sun, casting harsh shadows across the gravel forecourt. Tourists clustered shoulder to shoulder behind the ceremonial ropes, eyes squinting, phones raised, breath catching when the guards shifted in unison. But even in the oppressive warmth, not a single flicker betrayed the man stationed just left of the main arch. Corporal Alistair Gray stood motionless. The scarlet tunic clung to his frame, with impeccable symmetry, sweat lining his spine beneath the wool. His bearskin cap shadowed his brow, but not his focus. The public saw a statue in military red, a symbol. What they didn't see was the quiet tension tucked inside his stillness. He was 38, 8 years ceremonial, 14 active before that. Grenadier Guards, tours in Helmand and Kandahar, both of which left more than sand in his boots. They'd left ghosts, the kind that no longer startled him, but lived in the empty spaces between blink and breath. Today marked 6 years since Captain Reeve had been killed. His old CO, a man who never barked an order he wouldn't follow himself. Gray hadn't spoken about the date to anyone. He didn't need to. The weight of remembrance sat quietly in his spine. This was how he honoured it. Stillness, order, presence. He could hear the crowd beyond the rope barrier, shifting impatiently. American accents today, loud ones, diplomats maybe, or tourists mistaking Buckingham Palace for a movie set. He let the voices blur into background noise. They always did. He'd learned to ground himself in the quiet between steps, to find control, not in action, but in discipline. Every square foot of gravel beneath his boots was part of a centuries-old routine. His post wasn't just ornamental, it was institutional. And though tourists might not understand it, and diplomats might dismiss it, the rules here mattered. The ceremonial rope, thin, black and waist-high, marked more than a line between spectators and guards. It was a symbol. Cross it, and you weren't just stepping on restricted ground. You were dismissing everything it represented. Gray's gaze remained fixed on the horizon past the palace gates, eyes never darting, never searching. That was part of the training. You watched without looking. You listened without reacting. And in that moment, he felt it. A shift in the atmosphere, the kind of change that doesn't come from footsteps or whispers, but from authority approaching. His body didn't move, not even a flinch, but the air in his lungs slowed, sharpened. Something or someone important was arriving. He didn't know yet that before the hour ended, a single sentence would restore the balance between ceremony and ego. But for now, he stood still and waited. The black Range Rover rolled up with diplomatic precision, flanked by 2 unmarked escort vehicles that paused just long enough for clearance. Tourists near the palace gates shifted instinctively, murmuring questions, angling for better views. A few thought it might be royalty, others guessed American. They were half right. From the rear passenger door stepped Kamala Harris, Vice President of the United States, dressed not for pageantry, but for purpose. A slate blue suit, modest heels, no visible security badge. Her presence was sharp but understated. She paused for a moment, taking in the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, with that particular expression diplomats wear when they're still half in one conversation and already preparing for the next. Behind her, the doors opened in sequence. 3 aides, 2 cultural liaisons from the Foreign Office, and a small security detail emerged in practiced order. And then came the second wave, staffers, advisors, and finally the legal team. The tour had been arranged quietly, a gesture of goodwill from the palace, coordinated through the Foreign Office. A short walk-through of ceremonial spaces before a private reception elsewhere. Nothing formal, nothing press-facing. Just a brief cultural interlude. Kamala stood near the entrance, exchanging low words with a British liaison, while the rest of her team began to move toward the forecourt rope. Most followed the expected protocol, staying behind the line, taking in the surroundings respectfully. A few even nodded at the guards, but not Leo Dwyer. He was easy to spot, 40-something, broad-shouldered, and overdressed in a grey pinstripe suit that was probably worth more than some staffer's annual salary. He carried his confidence like a credential, shoulders squared, head slightly back, mouth already halfway through a command before anyone else had spoken. He didn't pause to assess the space, didn't ask which direction was permitted. He simply veered right toward the ceremonial rope and stepped across it without breaking stride. Corporal Grey didn't move. Not yet, but his awareness narrowed. He tracked the man's angle, the placement of his shoes, the direction of his shoulder line. Dwyer wasn't heading for the arch. He was walking directly through a restricted ceremonial quadrant, an area not open to foot traffic, even for palace staff. A red flag. Multiple, in fact. Grey had seen men like Dwyer before, not in suits but in ranks, captains and contractors who confused presence with power, the kind who mistook confidence for clearance. They always walked the same, as if the ground answered to them. A nearby steward, the kind stationed specifically for these diplomatic arrangements, opened his mouth to intervene, but stopped. His eyes went to the guard instead. Grey shifted. It was subtle. No drama, no clatter, just a clean, precise step, forward onto the gravel, enough to place himself directly in Dwyer's line of movement. The distance between them? 3 paces. Dwyer noticed the block, but didn't stop. Not yet. Behind him, the rest of the party slowed. One aide tapped another on the arm. 2 of the security detail exchanged glances, unsure if this was an anticipated route or an error in etiquette. And standing a few steps behind the rope, just far enough to remain uninvolved, Kamala Harris watched silently. She didn't say a word, not yet, but her eyes never left the scene unfolding at the edge of her reach. The gravel crunched beneath expensive leather soles as Leo Dwyer approached the final pace. Corporal Alistair Grey moved just enough to block the path. No threat, no flourish, just presence. The kind of presence that didn't shout, but didn't yield either. His boots planted square, his eyes fixed beyond Dwyer's shoulder, still technically motionless, but unmistakably in control. Dwyer didn't slow down until he nearly collided with the guard. He blinked, half offended. "Excuse me?" Gray's reply was steady, calm, and spoken just loud enough to be heard by those nearby. "This section is restricted. Please step back." Dwyer raised his eyebrows in exaggerated confusion. "We're cleared for a private tour." Diplomatic arrangement. Glanced behind him, as if expecting someone to back him up. "We're with the Vice President of the United States." Grey didn't move. Stationary quarters are not for negotiation. Words landed like stone. Tourists nearby stopped pretending not to watch. A few phones, previously aimed at the palace facade, now tilted subtly toward the confrontation. The moment had shifted from formal pageantry to something more human, more volatile. Dwyer scoffed. "Look, we're not trying to crash a parade here. I have clearance from both the Foreign Office and the US Embassy. I suggest you radio your supervisor and let them know we're coming through." Grey didn't blink. "My orders are standing. This boundary is not to be crossed." Dwyer narrowed his eyes. "Do you have any idea who I am?" The line echoed off the stone, like it had been said one too many times in places that didn't care. A nearby child whispered to his mum, "Is that man in trouble?" Corporal Grey remained perfectly still. "Sir, step behind the rope." Dwyer looked over his shoulder, expecting to see aides scrambling to mediate or security moving to support. But what he found instead was distance. Several aides had frozen just shy of the rope. One of them, a younger woman in a navy pantsuit, looked like she'd rather vanish than intervene. A palace steward stood about 10 feet away, hands clasped behind his back, saying nothing. His eyes were fixed squarely on the guard. Dwyer turned back, fuming. "You're making a mistake." Grey's tone didn't change. "No, sir, I'm preventing one." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was taut. Dwyer took one step forward. Testing. Grey responded in kind, shifting half a pace to keep the distance exact. No raised arms, no contact, just enforcement through geometry. Another phone lifted in the crowd. A woman whispered to her husband, "He's trying to strong-arm the guard." A teenage boy muttered, "This is going to end up online." And still, Kamala Harris hadn't moved. She stood a few paces behind the cluster of aides, arms loosely folded, sunglasses hiding her expression. But her attention was focused entirely on the two men at the boundary. Dwyer exhaled sharply and reached into his jacket, not for anything sinister, just for the familiar comfort of his badge. Gray's voice stopped him cold. "Sir, keep your hands visible." Dwyer froze. The implication hit harder than any insult. A flicker of colour bloomed high on his cheek. "You're being unreasonable." Gray's answer was quieter than before, but somehow more cutting. "This post does not flex for convenience." Another pause. Then, for the first time, Dwyer's posture faltered. Just slightly. The confidence didn't vanish. It wavered. But he didn't step back. Not yet. The tension rippled outward like a dropped stone in still water. What had started as a minor deviation from a diplomatic tour was now something else entirely. Tourists near the rope barrier had all but stopped pretending they weren't watching. Phones were out, discreetly but unmistakably. A woman holding a guidebook whispered, "Isn't that the American VP's team?" Across the forecourt, movement slowed. Even a group of schoolchildren on a field trip, wrangled by two harried chaperones, had grown unusually quiet. Leo Dwyer stood stiffly in front of Corporal Gray, his jaw tight, shoulders squared, like a man who refused to be corrected. He turned to the aide closest to him and muttered, "Where's Richard from the embassy?" "He was supposed to meet us at the gate." The aide shrugged helplessly. "Probably already inside." Dwyer made an exasperated sound. Then, loud enough for everyone to hear, he barked, "Can someone call ahead and get this sorted? We don't have time for symbolic delays." Still, Gray didn't move. His voice was level, entirely free of heat. "Your position does not override this boundary." The words sounded old, rehearsed, but not robotic, like something passed down, repeated in every training cycle for generations. And in this moment, they landed like law. Dwyer pivoted toward the steward near the palace wall. "You! Do you work here?" The steward blinked. "Yes, sir." "Then please explain to your guard that we are here on approved diplomatic access. I'm an officer of the United States federal court system. This isn't a negotiation." The steward's voice was far softer. "Sir, I'm not in a position to overrule ceremonial protocol. The guard is acting appropriately." Dwyer blinked. "Are you serious?" "I am." He inclined his head toward Gray. "He has full jurisdiction over ceremonial lines until clearance is formally confirmed." "I am the clearance," Dwyer said through his teeth. Gray didn't respond. That's when Kamala Harris moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, just one slow, measured step forward. The aides parted like water around her. Some stiffened, anticipating confrontation. Others quietly hoped she would smooth the situation over and let them inside. She said nothing. She simply stood, arms still folded, watching her own attorney push against a man whose entire job was not to push back, but to hold fast. Dwyer noticed her and straightened with relief. "Madam Vice President, this guard is obstructing us. We're scheduled, cleared. I told him we're under your authority." Kamala didn't answer. Not immediately. Gray remained as still as he had been since the first moment. Eyes forward, not making eye contact. His training dictated it. His integrity demanded it. Dwyer turned back to him with a smirk. "You're about to be overruled." That's when a voice, behind the rope barrier, belonging to no one in particular, broke the tension like a dropped pane of glass. "Is he seriously trying to intimidate a royal guard?" Murmurs followed. Some were hushed, some weren't. He crossed the rope. "Hey, you don't mess with those guys. They don't talk, let alone budge." Typical American, thinks the rules don't apply. Another aide reached for Dwyer's elbow. "Maybe we should just wait." "No!" Dwyer pulled his arm away. "This is absurd. It's a rope, not a border." Gray finally spoke again. Same tone, same control. "Sir, you are currently inside ceremonial grounds. I ask you one final time. Step back." The words were spoken with the kind of composure that didn't seek escalation, but would not yield an inch. Kamala Harris removed her sunglasses. It was a small motion, but the shift in atmosphere was immediate. For the first time in the entire exchange, Dwyer hesitated, not out of fear, but uncertainty. He looked at her for a signal. She gave him none. Instead, she stepped forward, and the entire forecourt held its breath. Kamala Harris walked forward, with the kind of control that made people move without being asked. The aides parted again, this time more deliberately. Tourists stepped back, without realizing they had, instinctively widening the invisible circle around her. The only two figures who didn't move were Leo Dwyer and Corporal Alastair Gray. Dwyer turned toward her, shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. "Madam Vice President," he began, "we've had a miscommunication. This gentleman seems unaware that we're cleared." She held up one hand. Not rude, not abrupt, just final. He stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes moved to the bearskin-capped figure in red, standing, immovable between her team and the ceremonial space. Gray hadn't shifted, hadn't even looked at her directly, but she knew he'd registered every movement. The tourists watched in total silence. Phones remained up, but no one was speaking. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. Kamala's voice, when she finally spoke, was low and calm. "He's right?" Dwyer blinked. "Sorry?" "He's right," she repeated. "You crossed the line." A ripple moved through the crowd. Not applause, not shock. Just that subtle vacuum of surprise when the expected script gets rewritten. Several aides looked at each other, unsure how to proceed. Even the palace steward's eyebrows lifted slightly. Dwyer gave a strained laugh. "Ma'am, with respect, this is protocol. This isn't about the guard. It's about our timeline." Kamala turned to him. "It's exactly about the guard." Dwyer opened his mouth, but her gaze was sharp now. Not angry, just cutting. "We were given a cultural courtesy, not a privilege, not sovereignty. This isn't our ground." Dwyer hesitated. His voice dropped an octave. "I didn't mean to disrespect." "But you did," she said, not unkindly. "You disrespected the post. You assumed access. And in doing so, you ignored everything this place represents." She turned back to Gray. "Corporal," she said clearly, "my apologies for the breach." For the first time, Gray's eyes moved, just enough to acknowledge her presence, a single, precise nod. Kamala looked back at her team. "We'll return to the waiting point. When the steward gives us clearance, we'll proceed the right way." There was no room for argument, no space to salvage pride. One by one, the aides stepped back behind the rope. Some looked embarrassed. Others just looked small. Dwyer stood for a second too long, still halfway inside the restricted space, unsure whether to double down or follow. Kamala turned slightly toward him, her voice soft but unambiguous. "Leo." That was all. He stepped back, quickly. A few tourists exhaled, as if they'd been holding their breath the entire time. One American man near the front whispered to his wife, "I've never seen anyone pull rank on their own team like that." A British teenager muttered, "That guard didn't even blink. That's mental." The steward cleared his throat gently and stepped forward, finally reactivating the scene. "If you'll follow me, ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin the interior brief as scheduled. This way, please." Kamala gestured to her team. They followed quietly, subdued. Dwyer didn't speak again. As they passed Corporal Gray, Kamala gave him one last glance. Not a smile, not a thank you, just respect. And then she was gone. Gray resumed his stance, still, silent, but no longer unnoticed. The sound of heels on stone faded toward the palace archway, swallowed by the structure's quiet grandeur. The diplomatic party moved on, silent, subdued, redirected. But the forecourt remained still. And Corporal Alastair Gray. He hadn't moved an inch. The tension that had hung over the space like heat off the gravel began to shift. It didn't dissipate. It transformed, from anticipation to something closer to reverence. A few tourists lowered their phones, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment they'd just witnessed. Others simply stood there, unsure what to say. Near the rope line, an elderly British couple leaned toward one another. The woman, dressed in a modest linen dress and wide-brimmed hat, whispered, "Haven't seen that kind of grace in years." Her husband nodded slowly, eyes still on the guard. She didn't defend her team. She defended the tradition. And he, the woman added, gesturing subtly toward Gray, never even raised his voice. A boy of about 10 tugged at his mother's sleeve. Mum, was that lady in charge of him? The mother smiled faintly. No, love, she respected him. The moment had realigned the dynamic. This wasn't the Queen's Guard as a photo op. This was something deeper. A collision between ceremony and power, and the ceremony had held its ground. The steward, who had previously stood frozen, now passed Gray again on his return path. He didn't speak, but as he moved behind the corporal's post, he paused, just long enough to offer a subtle nod, barely noticeable but deliberate. Gray didn't acknowledge it, not outwardly, but he registered it all. The silence, the shift, the way tourists were no longer leaning over the ropes, trying to bait him for a reaction. The way even the kids were quieter now, watching with a kind of wide-eyed awe, normally reserved for rocket launches or cathedral ceilings. A young woman, standing near the back of the crowd, lowered her phone. Did he even say anything? Just one line, said the man next to her. Stationary quarters are not for negotiation. The phrase hung in the air like a banner. One American father leaned down to his daughter and said, "That man in red?" He didn't just stop a lawyer. He stood his ground without even moving. Back near the front, the little boy who had asked about Kamala pulled out a toy soldier from his backpack and placed it on the ground near the rope. His mother started to stop him, but then didn't. It wasn't an offering, it wasn't a tribute, it was something simpler, recognition. The guard wasn't just part of the background anymore. He had become the centre. Without moving, without speaking, without demanding anything at all, Gray inhaled slowly, deeply. The air was the same. The weight of the sun hadn't lifted. But the court felt different. Like the gravel had remembered something it hadn't felt in years. A line had been crossed and then redrawn by silence, by discipline, by the one man who never stepped forward because he didn't have to. The hour passed without incident. Another shift of guards rotated through the archway with mechanical grace, boots striking the gravel in unison, tunics crisp under the sweltering sun. Tourists resumed their photos, some smiling again, some reverting to selfie sticks and quick group shots before the next item on their London itinerary. But something lingered. Corporal Alistair Gray maintained his position until the precise end of his assigned rotation. No visible change in posture, no trace of what had transpired earlier. To the untrained eye, he was simply another guardsman fulfilling a ceremonial shift. But those who had been there, those who had seen, watched him differently now. When his replacement arrived and the handoff was completed, Gray executed the formal march toward the palace archway. His movements were measured, not slower, not faster, just exactly right. He passed the spot where Leo Dwyer had stepped over the rope. It was empty now. Nothing marked it. No sign of the moment that had happened there. But Gray felt it all the same, like the faint echo of a bell long after the sound had faded. As he reached the edge of the archway, a quiet voice called out, not loud, not theatrical, just enough to catch him in the space between duty and departure. "Thank you." He didn't turn. But he heard it. A woman, likely in her 60s, stood just inside the rope line. No phone in hand, no camera, just a respectful stance and hands folded neatly in front of her. She didn't say it again. She didn't need to. Gray gave the smallest nod, barely perceptible, then disappeared into the archway, swallowed by the structure like thousands of guards before him. No applause followed, no statements, no attention-seeking headlines or public declarations, just the quiet return of a man who had held the line. The gravel settled behind him, the crowd thinned, and Buckingham Palace resumed its rhythm, unchanged as it always had been. But for those who had stood behind the rope that day, something would stay with them. Not a photo, not a soundbite, but a lesson. That sometimes the strongest act of resistance isn't stepping forward, and it's refusing to step back. Have you ever seen someone try to use power to break the rules and get humbled instead? Do you think ceremonial spaces like Buckingham Palace should be protected from political influence? Drop your answers in the comments. We read every single one. If this story reminded you why tradition still matters, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Tap that bell so you never miss a daily story. And if you know someone who thinks ceremony is just for show, share this video with them. Another powerful Royal Guard story is already waiting. Click the video on your screen now. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place.